rejected as too old for marriage. Apache woman was left behind until a cowboy rode back for her. The dust cloud on the horizon meant only one thing in the New Mexico territory of 1873: trouble was coming fast, and it was coming armed. Ayanna pressed her palm against the rough bark of the ponderosa pine, feeling the vibrations through the wood as hoofbeats thundered closer to her hidden position. 20 yards below, the trading post sat like a lonely wooden box against the endless expanse of high desert, its weathered walls the color of old bones under the merciless August sun. She had been watching the place for 3 days now, waiting for him to return. The riders crested the ridge, 5 men in dust-covered clothes, their faces hard as the rocky terrain they crossed. But it was the 6th rider, trailing behind the others, who made her breath catch in her throat. Even at this distance, she recognized the easy way he sat his horse, the broad shoulders that had once sheltered her from a desert storm, the worn leather hat pulled low over eyes the color of winter sky. Caleb Thornton had come back. 3 years. 3 years since that night when everything changed, when her world split apart like lightning striking dry wood. 3 years since she had last seen his face, younger than, unmarked by whatever hardships had carved new lines around those eyes. Now, as she watched him dismount outside the trading post, she could see how the frontier had changed him. His movements were more cautious, his hand never straying far from the Colt at his hip. The other men were talking, their voices carrying on the thin mountain air, but their words were lost in the whisper of wind through the pines. Ayanna shifted her weight, and a small stone skittered down the slope. The sound was barely audible, but Caleb's head turned sharply in her direction. For a heartbeat, she thought their eyes met across the distance, but then one of his companions called his name, and the moment passed. She knew she should leave, should melt back into the forest like morning mist, the way her grandmother had taught her when she was still small enough to believe the old stories about women who could become shadows. But something held her there, some desperate need to understand why he had returned to this place, to this memory that should have been buried with all the others. The Apache reservation lay 40 miles to the south, but it might as well have been on the moon for all the good it did her now. She had been cast out, declared too old for marriage at 20, a burden on her people during the hungry months when the government rations ran short and hope grew thinner than morning frost. The tribal council had spoken with voices like winter wind cold, final, unforgiving. She was no longer welcome in the village of her birth, no longer counted among the daughters of her people. That had been 6 months ago. Since then, she had lived like a ghost between 2 worlds, belonging to neither the Apache camps nor the white settlements, surviving on her wits and the skills her grandmother had passed down through whispered lessons and patient demonstration. She knew which plants would heal and which would kill, could track a deer through country that looked like solid rock, could read the weather in the shape of clouds days before the storms arrived. But none of that mattered now, because Caleb Thornton was standing 30 feet below her, and she was remembering things she had tried so hard to forget. The memory hit her like cold water that night 3 years ago when she had still been considered marriageable, when the Apache camp still welcomed her and the future seemed to stretch ahead like an open trail. She had been gathering medicinal herbs near the canyon where the old Spanish mission stood in ruins, its adobe walls crumbling back into the earth that had birthed them. The moon had been full, turning the desert silver, and she had felt safer than she should have. That was when the raiders came, not Apache, not cavalry. Something worse, men with no allegiance except to their own greed, who would kill for horses or silver or simply for the dark pleasure of it. She had heard their voices before she saw them, rough laughter echoing off the canyon walls, and had pressed herself against the mission wall, praying to gods both old and new that they would pass by. They had not passed by. She had been dragged from her hiding place, hands rough on her arms, voices speaking words she understood but wished she did not. They had plans for her, these men with their whiskey breath and empty eyes. Plans that would end with her body left for the buzzards and her spirit wandering lost between the worlds. That was when Caleb appeared. He had come out of nowhere, or so it seemed, a figure emerging from shadow like something conjured from the desert itself. Later, she learned he had been tracking the same men for days, following a trail of burned ranches and murdered families across 3 territories. But in that moment, all she knew was that Salvation wore a dust-covered coat and carried death in both hands. The gunfight lasted less than a minute. When the smoke cleared and the echoes died away, 5 men lay still in the silver moonlight, and Caleb Thornton stood over them like an avenging spirit from the old stories. His hands were steady as he reloaded his weapons, but she could see something in his eyes that spoke of costs paid and innocence lost. He had turned to her then, this young cowboy with old eyes, and spoken her name in a voice gentle as rain on desert flowers. "Ayanna, are you hurt?" She had shaken her head, unable to find words in any language. He had known her name. Somehow, this white man with his strange eyes had known who she was. Later, as they sat by a small fire he built in the shelter of the mission walls, waiting for dawn, he told her about the Apache woman who had saved his life 5 years before. His horse had stepped in a prairie dog hole, throwing him hard enough to crack ribs and split his skull. He had wandered for days, half-conscious, dying of thirst, until an old Apache woman found him collapsed beside a dried stream. "She could have left me there," he said, staring into the flames. "Probably should have, considering what my people have done to hers, but she didn't. Carried me back to her camp, tended my wounds, fed me until I was strong enough to ride. My grandmother," Ayanna had whispered, "she told me about you. Called you the one who would return when the spirits demanded it." That night they had talked until the eastern sky began to lighten, sharing stories and silences in equal measure. He told her about growing up on a hardscrabble ranch in Texas, about losing his family to cholera and his home to drought. She spoke of her life among the Apache, the old ways dying as the new world pressed closer, the young warriors growing desperate and the elders growing silent. When morning came, he had escorted her back to the edge of Apache territory, their horses walking side by side through country that belonged to neither of their peoples, but to something older and wilder than human claims. At the boundary marker, a cairn of stones built by hands long since turned to dust, he had stopped. "I'll come back," he had said. The words were simple, but they carried weight like a promise carved in stone. She had believed him then, had spent months watching the horizon, waiting for a dust cloud that would resolve into a familiar figure on horseback. But months turned to seasons, and seasons to years, and the dust clouds always brought strangers or soldiers or nothing at all. Now here he was, 3 years later, and everything had changed. She was no longer the young woman who had believed in promises. The Apache Council had cast her out, declaring her too old for marriage, too much of a burden for a tribe struggling to survive on government handouts and broken treaties. She had become what her grandmother had always feared she would become, a woman caught between worlds, belonging fully to neither. Below, Caleb and his companions were entering the trading post. The door closed behind them with a sound like finality, cutting off her view of the man who had once promised to return. She remained in her hiding place as the sun climbed higher, turning the desert into a furnace and the air into something you had to fight to breathe. The trading post had been built by a man named Sullivan, an Irishman who had come west after the war and never found a good reason to go back east. It was a squat, ugly building that served whiskey to cowboys, ammunition to whoever had coin to pay for it, and information to anyone willing to trade for it. Sullivan asked no questions about a man's past and offered no judgments about his future. It was the perfect place for conversations that needed to happen away from prying eyes and eager ears. Ayanna knew this because she had been watching the place for weeks, learning its rhythms and routines. Sullivan opened at dawn and closed when the last drunk could no longer stand upright. He kept a shotgun behind the bar and a derringer in his boot, and he had used both more than once to settle disputes that whiskey had started and pride refused to finish. The 5 men who rode with Caleb were strangers to her, but she could read them like tracks in sand. Hard men, dangerous men. The kind who made their living in the space between legal and lawless where most people feared to tread. Their clothes bore the dust of long trails, and their eyes held the wariness of wolves who had learned that survival meant never turning your back on anyone, not even your packmates. What business could Caleb have with such men? The boy she remembered had been wild, certainly, and capable of violence when circumstances demanded it. But these were not circumstances. These were choices. The sun reached its zenith, pressing down on the desert like the palm of God's angry hand. Still, Ayanna waited. Patience was a lesson the Apache taught their children early, along with how to read sign and when to run. She had learned all these lessons well, though none of them had prepared her for this moment, for the collision between memory and reality that was happening in the wooden box below. A commotion inside the trading post raised voices, though not yet angry. The sound of chairs scraping against rough floorboards. She pressed closer to the tree trunk, straining to hear, but the words remained frustratingly unclear. Then, sudden silence that stretched like a held breath. The door opened, and Caleb emerged alone. He stood for a moment in the narrow strip of shade cast by the building's overhang, his head turning slowly as he scanned the surrounding landscape. When his gaze reached the tree line where she hid, it paused, not settling on her exact location, but close enough to send ice through her veins despite the blazing heat. He knew she was there. Somehow, despite the distance and the concealment, despite 3 years and all the ways they had both changed, he knew. The realization should have sent her fleeing deeper into the forest, but instead, it rooted her in place like she had grown from the mountain itself. Caleb walked to his horse, a sturdy bay gelding with the look of an animal that had seen hard country and learned not to complain about it. But instead of mounting, he began checking the animal's tack with unnecessary thoroughness, his movements casual but his attention fixed on the tree line, waiting. The standoff stretched between them invisible, unspoken but real as the heat shimmer rising from the rocks. Ayanna found herself remembering the weight of his eyes that night 3 years ago. The way he had looked at her like she was something precious that had been lost and found again. The memory stirred something in her chest that she had thought buried beneath months of rejection and exile. A sound from inside the trading post broke the spell. Harsh laughter, followed by Sullivan's voice raised in warning. The kind of warning that usually preceded the sound of breaking glass or breaking bones. Caleb's attention snapped back to the building, his hand moving instinctively toward his gun. The door burst open, and the 5 men poured out like water through a cracked dam. Their faces were flushed with whiskey and whatever anger had been building inside. The largest of them, a man with shoulders like a bull and a beard the color of rust, was speaking in a voice that carried clearly in the thin air. "Don't matter what you promised, Thornton. Things change. Plans change. And if you don't like it, you can ride back to whatever hole you crawled out of and stay there." Caleb's response was quieter, but Ayanna caught the steel beneath the silk. "I gave my word, Briggs. That still means something where I come from." "Well, where you come from ain't here," Briggs replied, stepping closer. "And here, your word don't spend like silver." The tension between the men was thick as smoke, ready to ignite at the first spark. Ayanna had seen this before the moment when words stopped being enough and leads started talking. She should leave now, before the shooting started and innocent bystanders became casualties. Should disappear into the forest and let these white men settle their differences the way white men always did, with violence and blood. But something held her there. Some instinct, deeper than thought, that whispered this moment mattered in ways she could not yet understand. Caleb's voice, when it came, was soft as morning mist but carried the promise of storm. "I reckon we'll have to disagree about that." The words were barely out of his mouth when Briggs went for his gun. What happened next took less than 3 seconds but seemed to stretch like hours in Ayanna's memory. Caleb moved with liquid grace, his Colt appearing in his hand as if it had materialized from the air itself. The shot echoed off the canyon walls like thunder, followed immediately by 3 more in rapid succession. When the gun smoke cleared, 4 men lay motionless in the dust. The 5th, a younger man with pale eyes and shaking hands, had his weapon only halfway from its holster. He stared at Caleb with the expression of someone watching their own death approach on horseback. "Drop it," Caleb said quietly. The gun fell from nerveless fingers, hitting the ground with a sound like a breaking promise. "What's your name, son?" "Miller. Jimmy Miller." "Well, Jimmy Miller, I'm going to give you a choice. You can climb on your horse and ride hard for the next county, and we'll call this finished. Or you can try to be a hero and join your friends in whatever comes after this life. What's it going to be?" Jimmy Miller looked at the bodies of his companions, then at the unwavering muzzle of Caleb's gun. The choice, when it came, was not a difficult one. "I'll be riding, mister. Riding fast and far. Smart boy. Take their horses with you. I'm sure their families would want them back." Miller nodded frantically, gathering the reins of the riderless horses with hands that shook like aspen leaves in an autumn wind. Within minutes, he was disappearing into the heat haze, leading a string of mounts that would never again carry their owners. Sullivan emerged from the trading post, his shotgun cradled in his arms like a steel baby. He looked down at the bodies, then at Caleb, his expression unreadable. "This gonna bring me trouble, Thornton?" "Not from me. Can't speak for anyone else. They say you're fast." "Didn't believe it until now." Sullivan spat tobacco juice into the dust beside Briggs' still form. "What were they trying to get you into?" Caleb holstered his weapon with the same fluid motion he had drawn it. "Nothing good. Never is, with men like that." Sullivan gestured toward the bodies. "I'll take care of this. You might want to think about moving along before word gets out." Caleb nodded, but his eyes had already returned to the tree line, to the place where Ayanna crouched, heart hammering against her ribs like a caged bird. "I've got business to finish first." Something in his tone made Sullivan follow his gaze up the slope. The old Irishman's eyes were sharp as flint, but they found nothing in the shadows beneath the pines. "Business that can't wait?" "Business that's waited too long already." Sullivan shrugged, the gesture of a man who had learned when to ask questions and when to mind his own affairs. "Your choice, but if I were you, I'd be thinking about distance. Men like Briggs usually travel in larger packs. I'll keep that in mind." But Caleb was already walking toward the tree line, his steps slow but purposeful. Not the approach of a hunter stalking prey, but something gentler. The approach of someone trying not to frighten away something precious and easily startled. Ayanna watched him come, every instinct screaming at her to run, to fade back into the forest where she belonged, where she was safe from the complications that white men brought with them like trailing clouds of dust. But her feet seemed rooted to the earth, and her eyes refused to look away from the man approaching through the dappled shadows. He stopped just beyond easy speaking distance, close enough that she could see the new scars on his hands and the silver threading through his dark hair at the temples. Close enough to see that the boy she remembered had grown into something harder, more dangerous, but also more careful with that danger. "Hello, Ayanna." Her name on his lips was like water after drought, like sunrise after the longest night. It took every ounce of will she possessed to keep her voice steady when she replied, "Hello, Caleb. You've been watching me." It was not a question, so she did not treat it as one. 3 days. "Why didn't you come down?" The question hung between them like morning mist, fragile and easily dispersed. How could she explain the months of rejection, the council's declaration that she was too old, too much trouble, too far outside the boundaries of what a woman should be? How could she tell him that she was no longer the girl he had rescued, no longer someone who belonged anywhere or to anyone? "Things change," she said finally, echoing the words Briggs had thrown at him minutes before. "Some things do." His voice was soft, careful. "Others don't." He took a step closer, and she could see something in his eyes that made her chest tighten. Recognition, memory, and beneath it all, something that might have been hope. "I made you a promise 3 years ago. Promises don't have expiration dates." At least, mine don't. She wanted to believe him. Wanted it so badly it was like hunger, like thirst, like the desperate need for air when you have been underwater too long. But wanting and believing were different animals, and she had learned the hard way not to confuse the two. I'm not who I was then. Neither am I. He gestured toward the trading post, where Sullivan was dragging the first body toward a patch of ground behind the building. But that doesn't change what I promised. The Apache cast me out, declared me too old for marriage. The words came out harder than she intended, edged with all the hurt and anger she had been carrying. I don't belong to your world or mine. Maybe that's not such a bad thing. The response surprised her. She had expected pity or awkward discomfort, or the careful politeness that white men used when they wanted to extract themselves from uncomfortable conversations. Instead, there was something in his voice that sounded almost like relief. What do you mean? I mean, maybe belonging to a world isn't as important as belonging to a person. The words hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. She stared at him, searching his face for signs of deception or cruel humor, but found neither. Only a kind of quiet intensity that made her feel exposed, vulnerable in ways that had nothing to do with her precarious position between cultures. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying. He took another step closer, and now she could see the pulse at his throat, could smell the leather and sweat and gunpowder that clung to him like morning fog. I've had 3 years to think about it. 3 years to understand what I walked away from that night. You had responsibilities. Your own people. My people. The words came out bitter as alkali water. You know what my people did while I was gone? Started a range war over water rights that ended with 6 good men dead and nothing solved. Built a town where they could feel safe, then burned it down themselves when fear made them stupid. Elected a sheriff who lasted exactly 2 weeks before a gambler's bullet put him in the ground. He shook his head, the gesture sharp with frustration and old pain. I've been riding with men like Briggs because that's what the territory breeds now. Hard men for hard times, but I'm tired of it, Ayanna. Tired of living like violence is the only language anyone understands. So what do you want? The question came out smaller than she intended, like a child asking for something they knew they could not have. But Caleb's answer was immediate, certain as stone. I want to keep my promise. I want to take you away from here, somewhere we can build something better than what we're leaving behind. Where? North. Oregon Territory. There's good land there, cheap land. Room for people to start over. His voice gained strength as he spoke, painting pictures with words. I've got money saved. Enough to buy a spread, stock it proper. Build a house that's made for living, not just surviving. And what would I be in this life you're planning? Your Apache woman? Something exotic to show the neighbors? The question came out sharper than she intended, edged with years of watching white men take native women as curiosities or conveniences. But Caleb's response was immediate and fierce. You'd be my wife, my partner, the person I choose to face whatever comes next. Wife. The word hung between them like a bridge across dangerous water. In the Apache world, she was too old, too set in her ways, too much trouble for any man to want. In the white world, she would always be other, always be marked by the color of her skin and the shape of her features. But in Caleb's voice, in the way he spoke the word, she heard something different. Not possession or conquest, but partnership. Equals choosing to face the world together. Your people would never accept it. Then they're not my people. The simplicity of it took her breath away. To reject an entire world for the sake of one person seemed impossible, the stuff of old stories and legends. But looking at his face, she could see he meant every word. Still, acceptance was harder than wanting, harder than hoping. I need time to think. How much time? I don't know. He nodded, the gesture of someone who understood that some decisions could not be rushed. I'll be camped at Devil's Canyon tonight. You remember the place? She remembered. The old Spanish mission where he had saved her life. where they had spent that long night talking and learning each other's stories. The place where promises had been made and apparently not forgotten. I remember. If you decide you want to try this thing between us, come find me there. If not, he shrugged, but she could see the cost of offering her this choice. If not, I'll respect that too. He turned to go, but her voice stopped him. Caleb. Yeah? Why now? After 3 years, why come back now? For a moment, she thought he would not answer. His face had gone distant, as if he were looking at something she could not see. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as falling snow. Because I finally figured out the difference between being alone and being lonely, and I'm tired of being lonely. Then he was walking away, back toward the trading post where Sullivan was still dealing with the aftermath of violence. Ayanna watched him go, her mind spinning like a dust devil with all the implications of what he had offered. A new life, a new world, a chance to belong somewhere again, to someone again. But at what cost? And could she trust that his promise, 3 years in the keeping, was strong enough to bear the weight of 2 lives lived between cultures, 2 hearts trying to beat as one? The sun was beginning its long slide toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. Soon, night would come, and with it, the moment of choice that would define everything that came after. She had until dawn to decide. But as Ayanna watched Caleb mount his horse and ride north toward Devil's Canyon, she realized the decision was already making itself somewhere deeper than conscious thought. Her body was moving before her mind caught up, sliding down from her perch in the pine tree with the fluid grace that years of living between worlds had taught her. The forest welcomed her like an old friend, branches parting to let her pass, pine needles muffling her footsteps until she moved like a ghost through the green shadows. She had learned these skills as a child when her grandmother still lived and the old ways still had power. Before the reservation. Before the hunger winters. Before the council's harsh words had cut her loose from everything she had ever known. Her grandmother's voice echoed in her memory as she moved through the trees, speaking in the old language about choices that came disguised as endings, about trails that seemed to lead nowhere but actually led everywhere. The old woman had been a seer, gifted with dreams that showed pieces of what was coming. She had died before the worst of the changes came, but not before leaving her granddaughter with cryptic warnings wrapped in traditional stories. The coyote teaches us that sometimes we must become something new to survive, she had said during their last conversation, her ancient hands working beadwork while her eyes watched something only she could see. Not because the old way is wrong, but because the world itself has changed the rules. At the time, Ayanna had thought the words were about the coming of the white soldiers, the forced moves to reservation land, the slow strangulation of Apache freedom. Now, descending through the forest toward a different kind of crossroads, she wondered if her grandmother had been seeing something else entirely. The trading post fell behind her as she moved through country that belonged to neither Apache nor white settlement, but to something older and wilder. This was the borderland, the place where different worlds touched without ever fully meeting. It was fitting, she thought, that her choice should be made in such a place. A hawk circled overhead, riding the thermals that rose from the sun-baked rocks below. She watched it for a moment, remembering another of her grandmother's stories about the hawk woman who married a warrior from a distant tribe. The other women of her clan had called her foolish for leaving everything familiar, but the hawk woman had replied that some kinds of foolishness were wiser than the smartest caution. The memory brought a smile to Ayanna's lips, the first genuine smile she had felt in months. Her grandmother had always been crafty with her stories, weaving lessons into entertainment so skillfully that you learn things without realizing you were being taught. It was a gift Ayanna had never inherited, or perhaps had never had the chance to develop before circumstances tore her away from the teaching circle and thrust her into a world where survival mattered more than stories. The shadows were lengthening by the time she reached the canyon rim. Devil's Canyon stretched before her like a wound in the earth, its red walls carved by centuries of flash floods and wind into something that was both terrible and beautiful. The old Spanish mission huddled at the bottom like a broken tooth, its adobe walls the same color as the canyon floor. She could see the orange flicker of a campfire near the mission ruins, and the silhouette of a man moving between horse and saddle, making the small preparations that meant a long night ahead. Even at this distance, she recognized Caleb's movements, the economical grace that spoke of years spent living rough in country that forgave no mistakes. He had chosen the same spot where they had spent that night 3 years ago. Whether by accident or design, she could not say, but the symbolism was not lost on her. This was where her story with Caleb Thornton had begun. Perhaps it was fitting that this should be where it continued or ended forever. The descent into the canyon required careful attention. The walls were steep and treacherous, carved into layers of sediment that told the story of ancient seas and forgotten forests. One wrong step would send loose rock cascading down the cliff face, alerting anyone below to her presence. But Ayanna had grown up in country like this, had learned to read stone and sand the way other children learn to read books. She made the descent in silence, her moccasined feet finding purchase on ledges that would have been invisible to untrained eyes. The air grew warmer as she dropped below the rim, trapped heat radiating from rock faces that had been baking in the desert sun all day. By the time she reached the canyon floor, full darkness had arrived, and the stars were beginning to emerge in the narrow strip of sky visible between the canyon walls. Caleb's fire cast dancing shadows on the mission walls, turning the ancient adobe into something alive and watchful. She approached carefully, not wanting to startle a man whose reflexes had been honed by years of dangerous living. When she was still 30 feet away, his voice reached her across the darkness. "I was wondering if you'd come." There was no surprise in his tone, no question of who approached his fire. Somehow, he had known she would be here, just as he had known she was watching from the tree line that afternoon. "You were that certain?" "No, but I was that hopeful." She stepped into the circle of firelight, and he looked up from the coffee pot he was tending. The years showed more clearly in the dancing light new lines around his eyes, a scar on his jaw that had not been there before, a wariness that spoke of hard lessons learned in harder country. But underneath the changes, she could still see the young man who had appeared out of nowhere to save her life. "You look different," she said. "So do you." It was true. The months of exile had carved away the last of her girlhood, leaving behind something leaner and more dangerous. She had learned to survive alone in country that killed the unprepared, had developed the kind of watchful stillness that marked those who lived always on the edge of violence. "Coffee's almost ready," he said, gesturing to a second cup sitting beside the fire. "Unless you'd prefer something else." The casual domesticity of the offer struck her as almost surreal after the day's violence and revelations. Here was a man who had killed 4 people that afternoon, offering her coffee as if they were neighbors sharing gossip over a back fence. Coffee would be good. She settled across the fire from him, close enough to feel its warmth, but far enough to maintain the illusion of distance. He poured the dark liquid into both cups, then passed one across the flames. Their fingers brushed as she took it, and she felt the same electric shock of connection that had surprised her 3 years before. "Thank you." They sat in comfortable silence for a time, sipping bitter coffee and listening to the night sounds that echoed off the canyon walls. An owl called from somewhere high above, its voice lonely as winter wind. In the distance, a coyote answered with a song that spoke of wide spaces and ancient hungers. "Tell me about these 3 years," she said finally. He stared into the fire for a long moment before answering, as if searching the flames for the right words. "Mostly they were about learning who I didn't want to be." "What do you mean?" "After I left you that night, I told myself I was doing the right thing, going back to my own people, my own responsibilities. There was a ranch I was supposed to inherit from my uncle, a woman whose father thought I'd make a suitable husband, a life all planned out and waiting for me to step into it." He paused, taking a sip of coffee that seemed to burn more than warm. Took me about 6 months to realize I was dying by inches, living someone else's idea of what my life should look like. So I sold the ranch, disappointed the woman and her father, and rode out to see what the territory might teach me about who I really was. And what did you learn? That there are two kinds of men in this country, ones who build things and ones who tear them down, and that it's easier to become the second kind than you might think. The admission hung between them like smoke from the fire, heavy with implications she was not sure she wanted to explore. Those men today, Briggs and the others, what did they want from you? His laugh was short and bitter. They wanted me to help them tear down something that didn't deserve tearing. A stage line that serves the mining camps up north. Good people trying to make honest livings in a place where that's not always easy. But you refused. I refused. Finally figured out that just because you can do a thing doesn't mean you should. Took me longer to learn that lesson than I care to admit. She studied his face in the firelight, seeing something there that might have been shame or regret, or simply the exhaustion that came from carrying too much weight for too long. We all make mistakes, she said softly. Some mistakes cost more than others. Another silence stretched between them, filled with the crackle of burning wood and the whisper of wind through the canyon. When he spoke again, his voice was so quiet she had to lean forward to hear it. I killed a man in Tucson last spring. A gambler who was cheating soldiers out of their pay. Should have just walked away. Let them figure it out for themselves. But I was feeling righteous that day, feeling like justice needed a helping hand. He stared into the flames as if they held the face of the dead man. Turned out he had a wife, 2 young children. They were depending on his winnings to keep food on the table while he looked for honest work. My righteous justice left them with nothing but a headstone and a bill from the undertaker. Ayanna felt her heart clench with unexpected pain. Not for the dead gambler, but for the living man who sat across from her, carrying the weight of unintended consequences like stones in his chest. You couldn't have known. That's what I told myself, for about a week. Then I went to see them, the wife and children. Thought maybe I could help, make some kind of amends. His smile was sharp as broken glass. She spat in my face and told me to get out, said my help had already done enough. What did you do? Left money with a local preacher. Enough to see them through until she could find work or marry again. Then I rode away and tried to pretend it never happened. He looked up from the fire, meeting her eyes across the dancing flames. That's when I started riding with men like Briggs. Figured if I was going to be responsible for other people's pain, I might as well get paid for it. The confession hung between them like a challenge, daring her to judge him for the choices he had made. But Ayanna had lived too close to desperation herself to throw stones at someone else's survival strategies. And now? Now I'm tired of carrying dead weight. Tired of waking up each morning wondering what I'll have to regret by sunset. Tired of being the kind of man my uncle would be ashamed to call family. His voice grew stronger as he spoke, as if the words themselves were helping him remember who he wanted to be. I want to build something instead of tearing it down. Want to wake up in the same bed every morning next to someone who knows all my mistakes and chooses to stay anyway. The words hit her like arrows finding their mark, precise and devastating in their honesty. This was not the practiced speech of a man trying to win a woman's heart with pretty words. This was raw truth, offered without decoration or defense. And you think I could be that someone? The words hung in the desert air between them like a promise carved from starlight itself. Ayanna stared across the fire at this man who claimed she was already the someone he wanted to wake up beside every morning. This weathered cowboy who had somehow seen past the surface of her exile to something she had forgotten existed. You don't know me, she said, though her voice lacked conviction. Not really. 3 years changes people. It does. His agreement surprised her. But it doesn't change everything. That night when I found you at the mission, when we talked until dawn, I learned something about you that 3 years or 30 years won't touch. What? That you see people for who they really are, not who they pretend to be. that you understand the difference between surviving and living, and that you're brave enough to choose living even when survival would be easier. He leaned forward slightly, the firelight dancing across features that had grown familiar even after all this time. The Apache Council called you too old for marriage, but they were wrong about what that means. They were thinking like people who see a woman as property, something to be traded for horses or cattle. But being too old for that kind of marriage just means you're ready for the real thing. Partnership, choice, building something together, instead of one person owning the other. The observation struck her like lightning illuminating a dark landscape. She had spent months thinking of the council's rejection as a condemnation, a declaration that she was worthless, unwanted, beyond the pale of normal life. But Caleb was suggesting something different, that their rejection had actually been a kind of liberation. You make it sound like a gift. Maybe it was. Maybe your grandmother's spirits knew what they were doing when they made sure you wouldn't be tied down by other obligations when I finally came back. The mention of her grandmother sent a shiver down Ayanna's spine that had nothing to do with the desert night's growing chill. The old woman had always claimed that the spirits worked in ways too complex for human understanding, weaving patterns that only became clear when viewed from a great distance. She would have liked you, Ayanna said softly, grandmother. She always said the best men were the ones who understood that strength shared was strength multiplied, not divided. Sounds like a wise woman. She was. Too wise for the world that was coming. They fell into another comfortable silence, each lost in thoughts that stretched back through years of choices made and unmade. The fire crackled between them like a living thing, its warmth pushing back the desert cold that seemed to seep from the canyon walls themselves. Finally, Ayanna spoke the question that had been building in her chest since the moment he had offered her his vision of their future together. This place you want to take me, Oregon, what makes you think it will be different than here? Caleb reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a folded piece of paper, edges worn from handling. He smoothed it carefully before passing it across the fire. Letter from a friend of mine. Man named Samuel Chun runs a trading post near Portland. He married a Chinook woman 5 years ago, and according to this, nobody much cares about the color of anyone's skin as long as they work hard and pay their debts. Ayanna studied the letter by firelight, making out words written in a careful, educated hand. The writer described a territory where mixed marriages were common enough to be unremarkable, where native women served as guides and interpreters for wagon trains, where Apache and Chinook and Mexican and white children played together in the streets of growing towns. It sounds too good to be true. Maybe. But even if it's only half true, it's better than what we have here. She folded the letter and handed it back, her mind spinning with possibilities. A place where she could belong without having to choose between worlds. Where the children she had never allowed herself to dream of having might grow up free of the weight that had bent her own childhood under its burden. What would we do there? How would we live? I've got enough saved to buy land. Good land, according to Samuel. Rich soil, plenty of water, close enough to the new railroad to get goods to market. His voice gained strength as he painted the picture with words. We could raise cattle, maybe some horses. Build a house that's meant to last, not just shelter us until the next disaster. And you think I could learn to be a rancher's wife? The question came out more uncertain than she intended, revealing depths of insecurity she had tried to keep hidden. But Caleb's response was immediate and fierce. I don't want a rancher's wife. I want a partner. Someone who understands this country and its dangers, who can track and hunt and heal. Someone who can teach our children to read sign and weather and the hearts of horses. Our children. The words hit her like a physical blow, driving the breath from her lungs. She had never allowed herself to think seriously about children, had accepted the Apache Council's declaration that she was too old as the final word on that possibility. But sitting here in the firelight, listening to Caleb speak of a future that included small voices calling her mother, she felt something long buried begin to stir to life. You've thought about this, really thought about it. Every day for 3 years. The simple honesty of the admission made her throat tight with emotion. While she had been learning to survive as an exile, he had been building dreams large enough for two people. What if it doesn't work? What if we get there and find out we're too different, that the things that brought us together aren't enough to keep us together? Then we'll deal with it when it happens. But Ayana, what if it does work? What if we build something beautiful together? What if our children grow up free of the hatred that's poisoned this territory? She stared into the fire, watching flames dance and shift like the possibilities he was offering her. A life beyond survival. A future beyond exile. Children who would never know the bitter taste of being too much of one thing and not enough of another. I'm scared. The confession slipped out before she could stop it, raw and honest as a wound. But instead of pity or dismissal, she saw understanding in his eyes. Good. I'd be worried if you weren't. But being scared doesn't mean we shouldn't try. It just means what we're trying for matters enough to be worth the risk. A coyote's call echoed off the canyon walls, long and lonely as winter wind. Somewhere in the darkness, another answered, and then another, until the night was filled with wild music that spoke of pack and partnership and the ancient knowledge that some hunts required more than one hunter. The sound sent recognition through Ayana like electricity through wire. Her grandmother had always said the coyotes were teachers, showing human beings how to survive by adapting, by learning new ways when the old ways failed. And coyotes, she remembered, mated for life. There's something you need to know about me, she said, her voice steady despite the hammering of her heart. Something that might change your mind. Tell me. The Apache didn't just call me too old for marriage. They said other things. That I was touched by spirits, that I brought bad luck. That any man who took me as wife would find his horses going lame, his crops failing, his children born twisted. She met his eyes across the fire, daring him to flinch, to show even a flicker of doubt or superstition. They said I was cursed. Caleb was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. Then, to her amazement, he smiled. Well, if that's true, then I've been carrying your curse for 3 years now, and it's brought me nothing but clarity about what I want from life. You're not afraid? Of spirits and curses? No. Of losing you again before I've had the chance to really find you? That terrifies me. The honesty in his voice, the complete absence of fear or superstition, made something crack open in her chest like ice breaking in spring sunlight. For 3 years, she had carried the Apache Council's words like stones in her heart, believing on some level that their rejection had made her truly untouchable. But this man, this white cowboy who had no reason to see past the surface of cultural prejudice, was offering her something she had never expected to find. Acceptance. Not despite her differences, but because of them. Caleb. Yeah? Kiss me. He came around the fire without hesitation, his movements fluid as water finding its course. When he knelt beside her, she could see the firelight reflected in his eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his body in the cool desert air. His hand came up to cup her face, thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone with reverent gentleness. Are you sure? Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and closed the distance between them. The kiss was everything she had imagined during those long months of exile, and more than she had dared to hope for. Soft at first, tentative, like two people learning each other's language. Then deeper, more urgent, as 3 years of separation and longing found expression in the simple act of connection. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing hard, and Ayana could taste the future on her lips, coffee and promises and the wild freedom of choosing your own path regardless of what the world expected. So, Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, is that a yes to Oregon? It's a yes to trying, to seeing if what we have is strong enough to build a life on. He smiled, and in that expression she saw the boy he had been before the territory hardened him, the man he could become again with the right partner beside him. When do we leave? Tonight, now. The urgency in his voice surprised her. Briggs had friends, and word travels fast in country like this. By morning, there'll be men looking for the person who killed their meal ticket. You think they'll track us? I know they will. But tracking someone through desert is different from tracking them through forest and mountain. If we can reach the Colorado River before they catch up, we'll have enough of a head start to make the territorial line. The practical concerns of flight and pursuit intruded on the romantic haze that had surrounded their reunion, reminding Ayanna that choosing love did not exempt them from the harsh realities of their world. But instead of dampening her resolve, the prospect of danger shared seemed to strengthen it. How long to reach Oregon? 6 weeks, if we push hard and the weather holds. Maybe longer if we run into trouble. 6 weeks. 42 days of riding together across some of the most dangerous country in North America, learning whether the connection they had discovered by firelight was strong enough to survive the grinding test of daily proximity and shared hardship. I'll need to gather my things. There's a cave about 2 miles from here where I've been staying. How long? An hour. Maybe less. He nodded, already moving to break camp with the efficient haste of someone who had learned that survival often depended on how quickly you could disappear. I'll have the horses ready. We can follow the canyon north to avoid leaving tracks on the main trail. As Ayanna climbed back up the canyon wall toward her temporary home, she felt as if she were shedding an old skin, leaving behind the bitter exile who had watched from the tree line and becoming someone new. Someone who had chosen love over safety, partnership over solitude, hope over the bitter certainty of disappointment. Her few possessions fit easily into a single parfleche bag, spare clothing, her grandmother's beadwork, the small collection of herbs and roots that served as her pharmacy and pantry. 3 months of exile had taught her the difference between what she needed and what she merely wanted, and the lesson had stripped her life down to its essential elements. The most important thing she owned was not material at all, but the knowledge her grandmother had passed down through patient teaching and careful example. How to read the signs that predicted weather changes days in advance. Which plants could heal and which could kill. How to move through hostile country without leaving sign for enemies to follow. These were the skills that would keep them alive on the trail to Oregon, and they were hers by right of birth and training. For the first time since the Apache Council had cast her out, she felt valuable again, necessary, wanted for something more than mere decoration or convenience. When she returned to the canyon, she found Caleb had transformed their romantic camp into a military-efficient staging area. The horses were saddled and loaded, the fire reduced to cold ashes that had been scattered to eliminate sign. He had even swept the area around the mission walls with a pine bough, erasing footprints and other evidence of their presence. You've done this before, more times than I care to count. He took her parfleche and secured it behind his saddle, his movements economical and practiced. There's food and water for 3 days, ammunition if we run into trouble, medical supplies in case one of us gets hurt. What about your things? This is everything I own that matters. The simple statement said volumes about the life he had been living, about the necessity of traveling light when violence could erupt without warning. But it also spoke to his readiness for change, his willingness to abandon a rootless existence for the chance to build something permanent with her. They mounted in silence and rode out of Devil's Canyon like ghosts fleeing the scene of their own resurrection. The desert night wrapped around them like a blessing, concealing their passage from any eyes that might be watching. Above, the stars wheeled in their eternal dance, indifferent to human struggles, but somehow comforting in their constancy. The first few miles passed without conversation. Both riders focused on the demands of night travel through dangerous country. But as the horses settled into their steady ground-covering gait, and the immediate urgency of escape gave way to the longer rhythm of serious travel, Caleb spoke into the darkness. Tell me about your grandmother. What she was like. It was exactly the right question, offering Ayanna a chance to share the memories that had sustained her through the long months of exile. As they rode through the silver landscape, she painted word pictures of the old woman who had raised her after her parents died in a cavalry raid. who had taught her the secrets of plant medicine and weather reading and the deeper mysteries of living between worlds. "She always said I was born to be a bridge," Ayanna said as they paused to rest the horses beside a small spring. "Between Apache and white, old ways and new, the world that was and the world that was coming." Sounds like she was right. Maybe. Or maybe she was just trying to help me make sense of never quite fitting anywhere. Does it matter if the result is the same? The question made her think as they remounted and continued north. Did it matter whether her grandmother's prophecies were true visions or simply wise interpretations of a gifted child's nature? Either way, the old woman had given her the tools to survive in a world that had little place for someone like her. Dawn found them in high country, the desert giving way to pine forest and granite peaks that caught the early light like scattered jewels. They had covered nearly 30 miles since leaving Devil's Canyon, and the horses were beginning to show the strain. More importantly, they had reached the point where pursuit would become more difficult, where the trackers following them would have to choose between speed and stealth. "There's a town about 10 miles ahead," Caleb said, consulting a hand-drawn map. "Pinewood. We can rest the horses, buy supplies, maybe get news about who's following us. Is it safe?" "Safer than staying in the open. And we need to know what we're up against." Pinewood turned out to be the kind of frontier settlement that seemed to exist in defiance of common sense, a collection of wooden buildings scattered along a mountain creek, populated by miners, loggers, and the merchants who fed off both groups like pilotfish following sharks. It was rough, temporary, and exactly the kind of place where questions about anyone's past were considered impolite. They rode in like any other travelers, dust-covered and trail-weary, seeking food and rest and the basic necessities of frontier life. But Ayanna could feel eyes following them, measuring, evaluating, filing away details for later consideration. In a place like Pinewood, information was currency, and newcomers were always sources of potential profit. The general store occupied the ground floor of the town's only 2-story building, its shelves stocked with the eclectic mixture of goods that frontier communities required for survival. Caleb handled the purchasing while Ayanna lingered near the window, ostensibly examining bolts of cloth while actually watching the street for signs of pursuit or trouble. That was when she saw him. Jimmy Miller, the young gunman who had chosen discretion over heroics at the trading post, was tying his horse to the rail outside the saloon across the street. He looked older than he had 2 days before, marked by the kind of exhaustion that came from riding hard with fear as a constant companion. She moved closer to Caleb, pitching her voice low enough that the storekeeper could not overhear. "We have company. The boy from yesterday." Caleb's hands never paused in their examination of ammunition boxes, but she saw his shoulders tense slightly. "Where?" "Saloon. Just arrived." "Alone?" "I think so. But he wouldn't be here unless others were close behind." Caleb nodded almost imperceptibly, then raised his voice to normal conversational level. "I think we have everything we need. Ready to go?" They paid for their supplies and walked casually toward their horses, every movement calculated to suggest travelers in no particular hurry. But once mounted, they turned north at a pace that was just short of flight, putting distance between themselves and Pinewood as quickly as possible without appearing to panic. 2 miles out of town, they left the main trail and struck out across country, following game paths and creek beds that would make tracking difficult. The maneuver cost them time and distance, but it also cost their pursuers certainty, forcing them to choose between multiple possible routes. "How many do you think are coming?" Ayanna asked as they paused to rest the horses in a grove of aspen. "Hard to say, but men like Briggs usually travel in larger packs than what we saw at the trading post. I'm guessing 6 or 8, maybe more. And they want you dead. They want me dead, and they want you as a bonus. Apache women bring good prices in certain markets." The casual way he spoke of her potential fate sent ice through her veins. She had heard stories, whispered around reservation campfires, of women who disappeared into the shadow economy that fed on human misery. She had never imagined she might become one of those stories herself. Then we can't let them catch us. No, we can't. The pursuit continued for 3 days, a deadly game of hide and seek played across some of the most unforgiving terrain in the American West. Their enemies were skilled trackers, but Ayanna's knowledge of Apache woodcraft kept them one step ahead, leading their hunters through mazes of stone and water that made following them more art than science. On the 4th morning, they crested a ridge and saw the Colorado River spread before them like a brown ribbon across the desert floor. The sight should have been cause for celebration. Reaching the river meant they had effectively escaped pursuit, since few men would risk following them across the territorial line into country they did not know. But instead of relief, Ayanna felt only a growing sense of unease. Something was wrong. The landscape ahead was too empty, too quiet, as if even the wildlife had decided this was not a safe place to be. "Caleb, I see it." What they saw was dust, a thin line of it rising from the riverbank where no dust should be, unless something was moving down there. Something large enough to stir the earth, but disciplined enough to stay mostly concealed. They got ahead of us somehow. That's impossible. We've been watching our back trail for 3 days. Then they know this country better than we thought. Or they have more men than we estimated. The realization hit them simultaneously. They were trapped. Pursuers behind, enemies ahead, and the river offering escape only if they could reach it alive. "The crossing," Ayanna said, studying the terrain with the tactical eye her Apache upbringing had taught her. "There's only one good ford for 20 miles in either direction. They'll be waiting there. Then we make our own crossing. The current's too strong. We'd be swept away. Maybe. But certain death is still better odds than walking into an ambush." She looked at his face, seeing the resolution there, the willingness to gamble everything on a desperate play. It was the same expression he had worn that night 3 years ago when he faced impossible odds to save her life. "There might be another way. Tell me." "My grandmother used to tell stories about this stretch of river. Said there was a place where the old people used to cross before the Spanish came. A hidden ford that only showed itself at certain times of day when the light was right. Stories? Maybe. Or maybe the kind of knowledge that kept my people alive in this country for 1,000 years before yours arrived." He studied her face for a long moment, weighing legend against arithmetic, hope against the hard realities of pursuit and gunplay. "Show me." They worked their way down toward the river, using every scrap of cover the broken landscape offered. The dust cloud they had seen was larger now, close enough that they could make out individual riders moving in formation along the bank. 8 men, all armed, all positioned to cut off any attempt at crossing the obvious ford. But Ayanna was not looking at the obvious ford. She was studying the river itself, watching the way morning light played across the water, searching for the signs her grandmother had described in stories told around winter fires. There, a subtle change in the water's color, a line of stones just visible beneath the surface, the kind of natural causeway that might have been used by ancient peoples who understood this country in ways the modern world had forgotten. "Can you see it?" Caleb stared where she pointed, his eyes scanning the seemingly uniform brown water. "No, trust me." The words hung between them like a bridge across impossible space. Everything they had built together, all their hopes for the future, balanced on that simple request. "Trust me." "All right." They mounted and rode toward the hidden crossing, every step bringing them closer to either salvation or disaster. Behind them, shouts erupted as their movement was spotted. Ahead, the river waited with its ancient secrets and its promise of passage to a new world. The horses balked at the water's edge, sensing danger in the swirling current. But Ayanna spoke to them in the old language, the Apache words her grandmother had taught her for calming frightened animals, and gradually they stepped forward into the stream. The water was cold as winter, swift as mountain wind, hungry as the desert itself. But beneath the surface, Ayana felt the solid footing her grandmother's stories had promised, the line of stones that made crossing possible for those who knew where to look. Halfway across, with gunfire erupting behind them and bullets whining overhead, she finally understood what her grandmother had really been trying to teach her in those long-ago stories. It was not about secret fords or hidden knowledge. It was about the courage to step into unknown water when staying on familiar ground meant certain death. The far shore welcomed them like an embrace. Solid earth beneath the horses' hooves, safety stretching away toward distant mountains. They rode hard for another hour before finally allowing themselves to believe they had truly escaped. When they finally stopped to rest, Caleb dismounted and walked to where she sat beside a small creek, her hands shaking with delayed reaction to their narrow escape. "You saved our lives back there. We saved each other. That's what partners do." He knelt beside her, taking her hands in his own, steadying them with his touch. "Ayana, marry me. We're not even to Oregon yet. We don't need to be in Oregon to get married. We just need to be together." She looked into his eyes and saw everything she had ever wanted reflected there. Not just love, but partnership. Not just passion, but the promise of building something lasting together. The future they had talked about around the campfire was no longer a distant dream but an immediate possibility. Yes. The word came out soft as morning mist, but it carried the weight of worlds changing, of two people choosing to become something new together. 3 weeks later, they were married by a circuit preacher in a small town whose name they never learned, with witnesses drawn from the local saloon and a wedding feast consisting of beans and hardtack eaten under a canopy of stars. It was not the kind of wedding either of their cultures would have recognized, but it was theirs, and that made it perfect. Oregon territory welcomed them with rain and green hills that stretched away toward a horizon unlimited by desert or mountain. They found the land Caleb had dreamed of, rich soil beside a clear-running stream, and built their house with their own hands under skies that seemed to promise better days ahead. Their first child, a daughter with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, was born on a spring morning when the apple trees were in bloom, and the future seemed to stretch ahead like an open trail. They named her Hope because that was what she represented, the next chapter in a story that had begun with exile and rejection but was being rewritten with every day they chose to love each other. Years later, when Hope was old enough to understand, Ayana would tell her the story of how her parents met, how love had found them in the most unlikely place and carried them across impossible distances to build the life they shared. She would speak of her grandmother's wisdom and her father's courage, of the importance of choosing your own path regardless of what the world expected. But mostly, she would tell her daughter about the moment when everything changed, when a young Apache woman who had been declared too old for marriage discovered that being rejected by one world simply meant she was ready to build a better one. The desert had taught them that survival was not enough, that sometimes you had to risk everything for the chance to truly live. And love, they learned, was the most dangerous gamble of all and the only one worth taking. In the end, the Apache Council had been right about one thing. Ayana had been too old for marriage as they understood it, the trading of women like property, the surrender of individual will to tribal necessity. But she had been exactly the right age for partnership, for choosing her own destiny, for writing her own story in the vast open spaces of the American frontier. And when their grandchildren asked about the old days, about the time when the world was young and dangerous and full of possibilities, Caleb and Ayana would smile and tell them about the night when everything changed, when a cowboy rode back to keep a promise and an Apache woman chose love over safety. Because some promises, they learned, are worth keeping regardless of how long it takes to fulfill them. And some kinds of love are strong enough to cross any distance, brave any danger, and build any future that two people are willing to dream together. The desert remembers everything, but it also forgives everything, and in the end, that was enough.